Very few of Rome's emperors left behind extensive writings, and only a handful could be considered intellectuals. Julian the Apostate, who reigned from 361 to 363 CE, left behind a varied and interesting corpus of writings, most of which dated from his brief year and a half on the throne. In this video, I would like to briefly outline 7 of Julian's most interesting works and provide a brief introduction to each of them, which might be useful to anyone interested in reading these works, which are all available in English translation. Before I dive into the works that I plan to discuss, I would like to say a brief word about some of the texts that I am not going to cover in depth. Julian left behind a pair of panegyrics to his cousin, predecessor, and foe, Constantius II, which illustrate how a public figure may have to speak in a disingenuous fashion about someone he or she absolutely despises in order to solidify his or her own position. Julian also left behind a number of letters to various people covering a wide variety of topics. Some of these letters outline his policy objectives as emperor. As with Julian's larger works, these panegyrics and letters tend to be a bit verbose, less than perfectly organized, and a bit cumbersome, but they do show that he was well read and thoughtful. The hymn to King Helios is Julian's tribute to the god Helios, who he claims has been the god of his heart since an early age. While it is normally assumed that Julian was a Christian as a child, he seems to have had an interest in creating some distance from that part of his past, and he is a bit vague on when he embraced the rays of Helios. Helios is most commonly associated with the sun, and he was a very popular god with the Roman army during the Middle and Late Roman Empire. Helios is also associated with Sol, Apollo, and many other gods who have any kind of relationship with the visible sun. There are many of them, and you can look that up on your own if you are so inclined. In the hymn to King Helios, Julian highlights the role of Helios in people's lives and in determining their destinies. He views Helios as the king of the universe and the center of existence. Julian views Helios in 3 ways. 1. Transcendental, as the form of the good in the intelligible world. 2. As Helios and Mithras, ruler of the intellectual gods. And 3. As the visible sun. Julian's notions of the transcendental aspect of Helios come complete with the appropriate references to Plato's dialogues, and Julian also cites Homer, Hesiod, the Neoplatonic philosopher Iamblichus, and even some ancient Phoenician religious beliefs and practices. Julian dedicated this work to his friend Sallust, not to be confused with the historian who lived centuries earlier, and he claims that he was able to compose this whole hymn from memory in only 3 nights. So a kind of stereotypical Julian humble brag that we'll see a few more times before we're done. The hymn to the Mother of the Gods is a text very comparable to the hymn to King Helios. The Mother of the Gods is Cybele, a goddess whom the Romans had held sacred since her cult was imported to Rome during the Second Punic War. As in the previous hymn, Julian lays out his views of the goddess's importance and his ideas on religious belief and practice more broadly. As always, the text has an extensive number of references to the great authors of the past who influenced Julian. The text strikes me as less interesting than the hymn to King Helios, but it is equally useful for helping to establish the precise nature of Julian's religious and philosophical beliefs. Julian wrote 2 works on cynicism. Before laying out what Julian says in those 2 works, let me first lay out a very basic introduction to cynicism as a school of philosophy. Diogenes of Sinope was an older contemporary of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, and he is considered the founder of cynicism. Despite the meaning of the word cynicism in modern English, the term actually derived from the Greek word for dog, kunos. Diogenes and his apostles strove to live as simply and in accord with their nature as dogs do. To put it simply, they lived a homeless existence and divorced themselves from worldly concerns like wealth, political office, or societal norms. Cynics not only lived on the streets and refused to acknowledge the prerogatives of rank, but even went so far as to masturbate in public, urinate on public buildings, and defecate in the streets without shame, just as a dog would do. When Alexander the Great visited Corinth and met Diogenes, Diogenes only commented that Alexander was standing in the way of his son. Alexander reportedly said that if he could not be Alexander, he would be Diogenes. Whatever the truth of that anecdote, and however much philosophically inclined people might have admired some of the goals of cynicism, the reality is that almost all philosophers in antiquity hailed from wealthy families, and very few people had any interest in renouncing their position and power to become dogs. With that in mind, it is clear why Julian disliked cynics, but not as clear why he was so obsessed with them. The reason that makes some sense to me is that Julian was interested in systematizing and regulating pagan thought, and he was a Neoplatonist, so he tended to view all Greek philosophy as tending to be a different way of expressing the same truth that other schools of philosophy express. Cynicism seems to have opposed this trend towards uniformity. To the Uneducated Cynics is a work where Julian acts as a philosopher to try to criticize the lives and beliefs of the Cynic philosophers of his day. It is very clear that Julian was no fan of cynicism as a philosophical system. However, he tries to lay out a distinction between the true followers of the Cynic philosopher Diogenes and his false successors, who care only for bodily pleasures. In this text, Julian makes it very clear that he finds no philosophical value in the humor and ostentation that he detects in the Cynics of his time. Julian's view of all schools of philosophy, including what he defines as the quote-unquote true cynicism of Diogenes, Crates, and Antisthenes, is to follow the ancient advice of the Oracle of Delphi to know thyself, avoid vain opinions, and seek the truth. His claim that the Cynics are uneducated is based on his argument that the Cynics do not understand or practice what the true practitioners of their school taught. Julian, who is himself rather ascetic for an emperor, praised the asceticism of Diogenes and condemned the bodily pursuits of today's Cynics. Julian claims to have composed this work in a mere 2 days. To the Cynic Heraclius is directed to a specific Cynic philosopher rather than to Cynics as a whole, and it carries over a few themes from To the Uneducated Cynics. The central question of this work is whether or not it is appropriate for a philosopher to compose myth. Cynics, according to Julian, preferred to express themselves in myth, but this, in his opinion, is not appropriate for philosophical discourse. His main argument is that myth is not an appropriate format for advanced philosophical understanding, and that the Cynics should write discourses instead. Julian does make sure that he avoids condemning myth-making, since Hesiod clearly uses myth as his method of moral exhortation. However, he says that only people who are trying to not to offend or alienate their listeners and readers use myth to avoid speaking bluntly. Since the Cynics pride themselves on their freedom and outspokenness, Julian sees their use of myth as hypocritical and urges them to speak their minds bluntly. As usual, Julian cites a whole cluster of philosophers from Plato to Plotinus, and he also invokes the god Helios. The degree to which the Cynics would care about the writings of philosophers from other schools is unknown, but this doesn't strike me as a very effective rhetorical technique. As earlier, Julian once again accuses the Cynics of distorting Diogenes. Although he does not say how long he spent composing this work, it also seems to have been written in some haste, as the organization is less than ideal, and it often seems like he jumps between topics. At 215d to 216a, Julian provides an interesting passage on what he sees as the divisions of philosophy, which he lists as natural philosophy, practical philosophy, and logic. Despite his antipathy toward humor as a philosophical tool, Julian was not without humor and tried his best to incorporate it into 2 of his major works. In the dialogue The Caesars, Julian imagines a banquet for the gods where the gods summon up famous Roman rulers and Alexander the Great, and then judge each of these men for their merits. Each of the contestants is allowed to speak and feels an affinity with one of the assembled gods. The god Silenus cracks jokes about all of the contestants and seems to serve as a mouthpiece for Julian. Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar had a vigorous debate over who was the better general, but ultimately the gods decided that the height of wisdom and human virtue is not military prowess and conquest. Constantine I, Julian's cousin and the first Christian emperor, is mocked as a profligate and fool, along with Jesus. Ultimately, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the gods selected Marcus Aurelius as the best and wisest of the men they were judging that day, and only he is spared Silenus's sharp wit. Of all of Julian's writings, the Caesars is the best written and most enjoyable, in my opinion. During the winter of 362 to 363, Julian stayed at Antioch while he was organizing a campaign against Persia. Antioch was a heavily Christianized city by this point, and it was also fabulously wealthy due to its position astride a major trade route with the East. The rich and luxurious Christians of the city made fun of the ascetic and philosophical Julian, and he decided to respond with a self-deprecating piece he entitled Massagin, which translates as beard hater. The title refers to Julian's beard, which he grew to represent his relationship with the famous Greek philosophers of the past. Beards had made a big comeback in the Roman world of the 2nd century, but they were out of vogue by the 4th century. While he admits to not being the Antiochene ideal, his light praise of the Antiochenes is clearly intended to serve as backhanded praise for them and to point out that they were equally flawed and ridiculous from his perspective. Before the 3rd century, emperors had been willing to take a good ribbing from their subjects about their appearances and vices, and it seems that Julian, ever the traditionalist, was trying to embrace an earlier form of imperial self-presentation. It is very likely that Massagin was Julian's last major work, as he died during his Persian expedition in 363 CE. Julian's best-known work without question is Against the Galileans. The term Galileans is Julian's label of choice for Christians, and this work is Julian's refutation of Christianity. In this work, Julian acts as a direct heir to the previous writers Celsus and Porphyry from the 2nd and 3rd centuries respectively. While various church officials worked to get this text eliminated, Cyril of Alexandria wrote a refutation of Julian and ended up quoting lengthy sections of Against the Galileans to do so. As we have seen elsewhere, Julian likes to use Plato and other philosophers to inform his views. Against the Galileans contains a lengthy comparison between the creation account in the Bible and the creation account of Plato, which Julian regards as superior. One of the arguments that Julian uses against Christianity is that it is hard to believe that the God of the Bible is the God of creation if his chosen people, the Jews, had suffered conquest so many times and enjoyed very few successes during their already long history. By contrast, the Romans had conquered the world while worshipping their gods. Julian also observes that Hellenes, Egyptians, and Phoenicians are responsible for inventing all of the things that are good, whereas the Jews had not invented anything of note. Unfortunately, we don't know how popular this work was in its own time, or what parts of this work were excluded by Cyril. Thanks for watching. I'm sorry that it took so long to get back around to the subject of Julian. I suppose you could look at it as bookending the summer, one video before it, one video at the tail end. Coming up soon, I plan on doing a video to celebrate 100 subscribers. I have content coming in the form of 2 more videos about World War II neutrals, and I'm going to make a lot more videos about late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, since I'm currently teaching a course on that. And because it's an online course, I will have the opportunity, whether I want to or not, to make a lot of content on that particular subject. So stay tuned if you'd like those things. Rate, comment, subscribe, and whatever else people do on YouTube. Good night and good luck.